and get this man's thoughts on it because he's a longtime former NYPD lieutenant. He's now retired, and he's a cable news contributor, and he knows what he's talking about, and we always appreciate it when he gives us his expertise and his opinions. He is Darrin Porcher, who joins us right now on the line. Darrin, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
Hey, what's up, Darrin?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it, as always. Before we get to the rioting and the looting and all these officers that have been hurt, let's talk about the actual shooting first. And I understand you weren't there, and I understand you might not be privy to all the information, but I think you could give us a little bit of context. Tell me where, if you agree with me, it appears to me that this was justified, that you have a man that was mentally ill. I don't think police knew it at the time, that was carrying a knife, that was not obeying commands, that was walking towards officers. Darrin, what else could the officers have done differently, if anything?
Well, this is multi-layered. One of the first things we have to take in consideration is this was an individual that was experiencing mental illness. And so that being stated, there should have been some level of interdiction by social services prior to the police even showing up. So now we have the police on the scene. And if you look at the video, what the officers are doing is that they're backpedaling. One thing that's a common factor in police training in connection with people with weapons is you want to maintain something we refer to as the zone of safety. The zone of safety is 10 feet. You want to maintain that distance of 10 feet between yourself and the assailant. However, Mr. Wallace, that being the person that subsequently lost his life, continued to close the gap. And as a result of that, that's when the officers fired, and unfortunately, he lost his life. Now, there's a growing sentiment coming from all over in connection with why can't officers merely shoot someone in the leg? The truth of the matter is officers are trained to fire at center mass.
Right.
The reason why they're trained to fire at center mass is because it's the largest target. And so whereas if you fire at someone's leg or their arm, there's a good chance that you can possibly miss and that bullets can lodge at a location that you didn't intend on it landing in.
Gotcha. I'm glad you cleared that up because we talked a little bit about that yesterday, and I don't have the expertise that you have. So based on what you're saying, and I tend to agree with you, it doesn't sound like the officers had a choice to do anything else. Am I right by assuming that?
Well, whenever we think in connection with the deployment of deadly physical force, that being the use of your firearm, it's what that officer feels or what they envision based on the position that they're in. We can always Monday morning quarterback things on the back end, but through the purview of the lens that officer is experiencing this encounter, this is what he felt was appropriate. And I looked at this as an appropriate shooting. I'd say I use the term lawful but awful. I mean, the use of force is always ugly, and it's awful when you look at it from the back end, but it was lawful.
Right. And I look at what took place in Minnesota in that officer-involved shooting that took place a few months ago. And I don't know whether that was justified or not, Darrin, but what I am saying is completely different circumstance, right? You have a guy that's walking away from police and he's shot in the back. This is a completely different circumstance. And again, I don't know if that shooting in Minnesota was justified or not, but I think there are plenty of questions, I'm sure you would agree, that need to be answered. This is completely different. We had the video. It's so clear cut. So I have to ask you this. When you look at, Darrin, your brothers and your sisters who are being attacked, and I'm talking about the police officers in Philadelphia, all of whom had even nothing to do with this shooting, and it looks like the shooting was justified, and I agree with you. What would you say to those people out there in Philadelphia and the carnage of the last couple days and what's taking place right there? 30 officers injured. Some officers had to go to the hospital. And for what and why? What would you say to those people and what we're seeing in this country, so many people rushing to judgment?
We need to reflect on the teachable moments of what happened back in May in the wake of the death of George Floyd. We had riotous behavior that subsequently tore down these neighborhoods, and there was no plausible solution that was fruitful in connection with these riots that happened in the death of George Floyd. Fast forward, this is where we are right now. The tea leaves clearly reflect that that did not work. So moving forward, if you burn down the same neighborhoods that you burned down back in May, you can't expect a different outcome. It's an insane behavior when you commit to the same activity and expect a different outcome. That being said, it puts that population at risk. There is 1 million plus residents that live in the city of Philadelphia that are under siege based on a small minority of people that are committing to acts of anarchy. This is the time that we need to coalesce behind law enforcement and await the investigation that will give a more comprehensive overview of what the situation entailed. But discourse is the best way to engage in this and not rioting and anarchy.
Agree. If you're just joining us, we're speaking with Darrin Porcher. He is a retired, longtime NYPD lieutenant. Also, you see him all over cable news talking about these issues. So, Darrin, I want to ask you this. I am not into character assassination. I'm not into it. However, I want to bring up somebody's past when the family portrays an individual as some sort of hero, when people in the streets portray this individual as some sort of hero. I want to get your thoughts on this because this guy Wallace, and it's very sad, nobody wanted this man dead. It's a horrible situation. He was an aspiring rapper with social media accounts filled with videos. The guns seem to be a central theme as he rhymes about shooting people, including police. His videos do also, though, include songs about social causes and police injustice. But court records do show that he was awaiting trial for allegedly threatening to shoot a woman and her house up. In 2017, he pled guilty to robbery, assault, possessing an instrument of crime after kicking down a door of another woman and putting a gun to her head. In 2013, he pled guilty to assault and resisting arrest after punching a police officer in the face. Darrin, I have a serious problem with people portraying this man, dead or alive, as some sort of hero because he is no hero. In fact, you can make the argument he was the opposite of that. What do you say?
I think that this is multifaceted. When we look at the particular situation in question as it relates to the shooting, it was the family of Mr. Wallace that called the police, and that's why the police responded based on him waving around a knife. Granted, we have a troubling background in connection with who Mr. Wallace was based on his past encounters, but we need to specifically focus on the incident in question, that being the police shooting. And this is a police shooting that, from my perspective, appeared to be a sound practice on the part of the police because the officers had the right to employ deadly physical force. Granted, this is a troubling past with Mr. Wallace, coupled with a growing sentiment of mental illness that he's experienced. Why he never received the necessary services is questionable. But going back to what I stated initially, we need to focus and spearhead what happened that day as it relates to what that officer's encounter with Mr. Wallace was. And I believe that this was a justified shooting. And as a result of that, the public needs to coalesce behind police so they can move forth the social contract to ensure that that population of Philadelphia is safe.
I agree. Let's talk about the public. Let's talk about the looting. I guess this is the billion-dollar question here, and maybe you could help me understand it. Why can't police stop the looting? Why can't they stop these I shouldn't say vigilantes, but these criminals, and not all of them, but some of them, who are trying to injure and succeeding, sadly, at injuring police officers, looting? Why can't police, I guess it's easier said than done, and Darrin, you could shed some light on this, but why can't police stop this sort of behavior?
Well, the narrative it's multifaceted. One of the first things we have to take in consideration is there are far more civilians in Philadelphia than there are police officers. Therefore, it's essential that you have that police and community relationship to bridge the gap in connection with that acrimonious relationship that exists periodically with the community. If you don't have that police and community relationship, then you're more subjected to behavior as what we see that's being portrayed in Philadelphia. You know, recently they just brought in the National Guard, and they're going to do what they can from a perspective of omnipresence. And I just think that it's just a matter of time, or the state police may even be on the ground. But you have a three-tiered approach from a law enforcement perspective, that being the local PD, meaning the Philadelphia Police Department, the state troopers, meaning the Pennsylvania state troopers, and the National Guard. The triangulation of those three components will help to bring, I should say, it should be essential in terms of bringing calm, but it goes back to why can't we have that better relationship? And this is something that we need to constantly engage through intelligence sources to assess what the pulse of the community is, and we can get in and interdict it early as opposed to when it gets to this combustible nature of what we see. This riot didn't happen this week. This riot happened in the past, but I don't believe the intelligence sources were able to make the proper assessment and effectively get in and interdict the acrimonious relationship between police and community. That being said, the police have to do the best that they can with those three components to quell the violence. It will happen, but unfortunately, we're going to experience a level of socioeconomic deprivation as a result of businesses being looted, rioting that's happening in that community.
I mean, if you watch, there's videos out there where police officers are. You mentioned how there's significantly more residents of downtown Philadelphia than there are police officers, and that's abundantly clear to me. I watched a video, and there are police officers literally they're retreating, they're running away from looters or rioters or criminals or anarchists or whatever you want to call them. Last night, Tom Wolf said that he was going to bring in the National Guard, and he never did. And there were businesses that were looted last night. There was one business that was looted before in May, and then he restocked. He was ready to open for Christmas, and then he was looted again last night. I mean, there's video of Walmart being just completely ransacked. I mean, you mentioned how there's a million residents in downtown Philadelphia. A lot of those residents now, they don't even have access to groceries because those grocery stores have been looted. I mean, at what point do you put the responsibility on the looters and not on the relationship between the police officers and the looters?
Well, I do wholeheartedly place the responsibility on the looters. In no way, shape, or form is it the police department. I was speaking to how the police would effectively interdict the looters and bring a sense of calm. But it's wholeheartedly shouldered by the looters. These people, and I want to say it's a minority, not the majority of that community, they are opportunists. They're highly selfish individuals that focus on one thing, and that's themselves. As you mentioned earlier, and as I mentioned earlier, they looted and they pillaged that community back in May, and then you had a lot of the business owners that refurbished their establishments subsequently to be looted all over again. The responsibility is shouldered completely on those rioters, and these are selfish people that in no way, shape, or form should be on the street. They should be incarcerated and face a judge, and the judge should implement whatever necessary punishment that should be instituted by the criminal justice.
Why do you think that those looters and those who are deciding to engage in those activities and to injure those? I mean, you saw the truck that was literally driven into a line of police officers. You heard about the bricks that were thrown off of
female police officer.
Yeah, that were the 52-year-old that were thrown off of rooftops. I mean, why do you think? What do you think perpetuated that horrible relationship in their own mind between themselves and police officers? Like, what do you think is pushing that?
It's a culmination of things, and it goes back to it's necessary for a police department, and oftentimes you have a community affairs bureau within a police department that makes the assessment of the pulse of the community, and it's very important for you to constantly understand where the community stands. So when we have these combustible situations such as what happened here, you should be able to get to this much earlier than it happening where it did. Now, in terms of what the state of acrimony that which was in existence in that community is, that's something that I don't have the answer to. But I think the key is having forward intelligence, meaning consistently assessing the pulse of what that community has a need for or request for, and that's where you get the answer through the discourse. But if you wait till the last minute, like what happened here, that's when you have this explosion or this kettle of TNT, so to speak, that's plaguing the city with riots.
So I have a question, but just as far as political implications here. In Philadelphia, in Allegheny County, about 30% of votes of the state has voted in Pennsylvania, and then a lot of it has been mail-in ballots, and a lot of that took place in Philadelphia and Allegheny. And Pennsylvania is one of those states where you can actually change your vote if you voted early on Election Day. Do you believe that what's happened the last couple of days will help push the state red?
Well, I genuinely believe that it's already baked in the cake in connection with who someone is going to vote for. I don't really think that you have many undecided voters at this stage of the game, considering we have an election coming up next week. And so in terms of pushing the state red, I can't speak to if it happens or if it doesn't happen. One thing I will say is you have more residents in the state of Pennsylvania that have been turned off based on the anarchy that's happening recently, coupled with what happened with the death of George Floyd, with the inability of elected officials to subsequently contain the violence that has plagued these communities. So that being said, I think you have a lot of those people that have already understood and accepted this is my candidate of choice before they even walked into the voting booth, before what even happened this week. So I don't really think that you're going to have much of a seismic shift in connection with the electorate.
I agree with you. Okay, so let's go back to your actual expertise, which is being a former NYPD lieutenant. So I want to talk a little bit about my frustrations with some of these family members that get millions and millions of dollars. And I'm not talking about Breonna Taylor because I think that was deserving of the family. But let's talk about this specific case again. I don't believe this man's family deserves any money. And I find it quite interesting, Darrin, and you alluded to this. You know, the system failed this man when it came to him getting help because of his mental illness. Where was his family then with all the issues he's had for decades? And now all of a sudden we're led to believe that the family cared so much about him and he was mentally ill and they were doing whatever they could to help him. Number one, I don't believe that. I think they're lying. And number two, I believe they want a payday. I'm going to tell you something, Darrin. If this family or anyone associated with this man gets lawsuit money, it's a sham to me because they don't deserve it, quite frankly. The man was the one who held up a knife and was walking towards officers. I don't know. I don't see how this is going to play out, but if it does play out that way, Darrin, I think it's disgusting. How do you see this playing out?
Well, it's twofold. The first thing is we have to remember it was the family that, in fact, called the police for Mr. Wallace's behavior, and the police subsequently responded based on the family's call to 911. Mm-hmm. The second piece to that, when we look at civil liability and how these lawsuits play out, traditionally you have a corporation counsel that defends the municipality, that being Philadelphia. And oftentimes they will settle as opposed to going through the long draconian court process, because it's more financially prudent to settle up front as opposed to going through a court case or a court battle that can draw on for months. And so they will settle for an amount of money that's significantly less than if they were awarded a settlement with the final judgment in the courts in the civil case. This is a civil liability case, and it goes back to it's unfortunate, but like it or not, these people are going to reap the benefits of their loved one's loss. And just understand, no matter how crazy a person is, it's always a tragedy when a loved one is lost. Mm-hmm. I genuinely believe that family was not in favor of Mr. Wallace in the first place. But ultimately, whether we like it or not, there's going to be an attorney that scoops this up and enters this into a civil proceeding, and the corporation counsel will settle, and that's the way this thing is going to go.
Point well taken. Even though I disagree with it, I appreciate your time, Darrin, and I appreciate always when you come on this show and your expertise. Really great stuff, and look forward to having you on again sometime soon down the road. Hopefully it could be under better circumstances, because it's horrible when we have to continue to talk about these officer-involved shootings and officers that are put in harm's way. Darrin Porcher, thank you so much, as always.
As always, a pleasure appearing on the show. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Darrin. You are outstanding.
That is retired NYPD Lieutenant Darrin Porcher, who is also a cable news contributor.
I would say he's one of the smartest guests we've ever had on the show.